Hi guys, for today we're going to discuss movement in directing. So there is always movement in film, even in still photograph. So suggestion of movement, apparent movement, okay? Actual movement can be seen for both film and photograph. Now, movement can be created in 4 different ways. So you have actual movement, where the subject moves throughout the environment inside the screen. Then you have apparent movement, when it looks like something is moving, but apparently it's not. It's just a way of introducing or suggesting movement. Next is induced movement, where the camera is used or other elements are used to basically suggest again movement. And lastly, you have relative movement. So let's go through it one by one. When you say actual movement, it occurs only in the real world. Almost everything in our 3-dimensional world that moves is classified into this category. So walking people, flying birds, moving cars are example of constant actual movement that we see every day. Okay, that's actual movement, not just on screen but also in the real world. Now you have apparent movement, when one stationary object is replaced by another stationary object. The change between the two objects may be perspective as the movement of the single object. Okay, this creates apparent movement. Now, film and video rely on this principle. When the real world actual movement is photographed into film or video. So it is transformed into a series of still pictures. Now, film and video can play back these pictures at 24 to 30 frames per second. So even now, you have more than 30 frames. You can even have 60 frames or even more. Okay? And the pictures appear to move by the movement. But the movement is apparent. It's not actual. Because, again, it's just when you talk about film, essentially, it's a series of still images that is unraveled to you sequentially. Now, to prove if we can freeze a frame or step through the film or video frames and see each still pictures individually, animation is made up of series of individual drawings, like what I've said, or pictures when we show it at 24 to 30 frames per second. So again, it is unraveled to you in such sequence or in rapid sequence that when you do it or when you see it, okay, it communicates or it is moving apparently. But if you freeze it or if you sequence it or if you dissect every frame, you can see that it's not really movement, but it is only apparent movement. Apparent movement also occurs in the real world. So, for example, rows of light bulb on outdoor signs can blink in a specific sequence that it creates a blinking. Okay, and if that blinking is fast enough, then the lights seem to chase or move along the rows. Okay, like this, for example. Okay, a series of stationary neon arrows are on a lighted sign. On a lighted sign can give the appearance of a single moving arrow. If each arrow is lit for a short time in rapid succession, okay, like seen by the numbers indicated on the left side of the figure, so 1, 2, 3, and 4, the arrow appears to move. The movement is apparent, not because it is moving or the arrow is actually moving, but because it, in terms of sequences, so it becomes apparent movement. Because there is no actual movement at all. It's only a series of rapidly changing and stationary pictures. Okay? So it's the same concept in film. Next, we have induced movement. Now, induced movement occurs when a moving object transfers transfers its movement to a nearby stationary object. The stationary object then appears to move, and then the moving object appears stationary. This actually happens a lot when you're driving. For example, induced movements sometimes occurs at a traffic intersection. So have you ever had the experience of you driving, or you in riding, for example, in a car? Okay, then your car stopped next to a large bus. If the bus slowly moves forward, diba, you can feel as if your car is drifting backwards. So this feeling is induced movement. So akala mo gumagalaw ka, but then again, you're not really moving, or you're stationary, but your reference is the one actually moving. Okay? You're not really moving forward, but the movement of the bus induces a sense of movement in your car. And you feel that you are moving in the opposite direction of the bus. Okay? In the figures in front of you, the back circle moving to the right, the black circle moving to the right, and the green circle will actually, if you are riding, for example, so the green circle is the apparent movement or the induced movement. Usually the movement will transfer to the smaller and brighter object. Okay? So this is an example of induced movement, but it's done in the background. So you can see this is what they actually do in old Hollywood when shooting a car scene, a moving car scene, is that they have a projected background at the back, and then they have an open, let's say, an open front car, and the wind that you're seeing is actually just a fan in front of the actors. Okay? It suggests movement because, again, the perspective is inside the frame or inside the screen, and what you see in the movement in the background is actually just induced movement. Now we have relative movement. When you say relative movement, it occurs when the movement of one object can be gauged by its changing position relatively to a second stationary object. Okay, I'm going to give you an example, or I want you guys to imagine my example. So, but for this sake, the black circle appears to move because of its position, and it changes relative to the stationary green circle in the frame. Okay? In the screen world, visual movement can be produced only when an object moves in relation to the frame line. When the objects do not move in relation to the frame line, there is no movement. Okay? So this is my example. I want you guys to imagine yourself, or I want you to imagine yourself watching a film. Okay? Okay? Now, the film is a photograph of a moving car in an open desert. And the desert provides a visual sparse environment with only a horizontal line. So, ibig sabihin, wala kang nakikita, just the horizontal line because of the desert. Okay? Now, imagine the car moving in a circular pattern. And the camera is in the center, panning relative to the movement of the car. Now, the car map shows that the car will drive in circles around the camera, and the camera will pan with the car. Keep it centered in the frame. Now, the result will be that the car appears stationary in relation to the frame. So, the car doesn't actually, or the car will appear not to move at all. The clue lang is the moving, what you call this, the moving wheels. For example, tanggalin mo yung elemento ng moving wheels, then the car will not appear to move at all. Okay? Now, visually, there is no car movement because the physical relationship between the car and the frame does not change. Okay, kung hindi siya gagalaw dun sa frame, then you're not going to see any movement. Because, again, the background, okay, does not show movement at all because pare-pareho lang yung itsura ng background. There is no relative movement because there is nothing in the frame to reveal the car's movement. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you another example. The same car, but this time, let's put stationary objects in the background. Okay? If, for example, we change the location from the desert that doesn't have any stationary object, and you just show a horizontal line, okay, to a forest. Okay? As the camera pans to follow the car, the trees in the background, of course, will move in the opposite direction as the camera pans. Now, the tree movement will reveal that the car is moving, even though the car is not really moving in relation to the frame. Kasi it's just centered in the frame, but when you see the objects moving in the background, it suggests that it is movement. Now, that is what is called relative movement. Now, the moving tree generate apparent movement, and the viewer transfers that movement to the car. There is still no relative movement because the car remains stationary in the frame. Okay? Now, for the third location, okay, it is an open road. So this time, the car will drive through the frame and the camera will remain stationary. Yung kanina kasi, nagpapan. Okay? So relatively, there's no movement if centered lang yung panning. But for this instance, the camera will remain stationary and the subjects are the ones who will move, okay, relative to the location. Now, the car creates a relative movement because its position is changing in relation to the frame. So, ibig sabihin, baliktad naman. So, kanina, yung example natin, the frame or the background is moving. Now, this time, the background is not moving. Stationary lang yung camera. Of course, the subject is moving. Okay? The subject is moving. So, it creates relative movement also. Nabaliktad lang natin yung elements. Of course, we have simple and complex movements. Now, in the real world, actual movement occurs in 2 or 3 dimensions. But the surface of the screen is not only 2-dimensional, so objects in the screen world actually can move only in 2 dimensions. Okay? So, pag nilagay mo na as a footage, pag nilagay mo na siya as video, so you only have a 2-dimensional screen. Diba? That creates 3-dimensional perspective, pero essentially you have a 2-dimensional screen. There is no real movement in depth on a screen because, of course, again, it's flat. It's not 3-dimensional. Okay? So, that's where simple and complex movement comes in. In the screen world, there are only a few 2-dimensional directions in which an object can move. So you have horizontal, you have vertical, you have diagonal, and you have circular. So those are simple movements. Okay? Now, objects in the real world can move in depth, advancing or proceeding from the camera when photographed. Okay? Then it becomes complex movements na. So before, you only, in terms of 2-dimensional, diba, there are only simple movements. Okay? Now, these objects can appear to move in depth toward or away from the viewer. Okay? This is illusionary depth because, again, relatively or technically, the screen is 2-dimensional only. Okay? So, illusion lang yung depth na nangyayari. Now, nothing can move in depth of the screen because the screen is flat. But objects movement that appear to move in depth on a flat screen is called complex movement. So pagka from afar, di ba? Going, it's not really moving, it's actually a complex movement because it's not it suggests that when, for example, from a two-dimensional object, di ba yung visual progression natin from a point to a two-dimensional object, diba? So it creates complex movements. Now, in the real world, again, a car can actually move on 3 dimensions and drive towards the camera. Okay? Pero of course, in the screen world, the car can't move forward the viewer because the screen is flat. The car's screen movement appears deep because of simple moves, because simple moves are combined. Okay, so simple movements, when you combine it, it becomes complex movement. Now, the top of the car is moving up. The bottom is moving down. The left side is moving left. And the right side is moving right. Okay? The more simple moves combined on a single object, the more complex or deep the movement will appear on screen. The screen car also uses depth cues of size change. So, ito na. Diba? Size change. That's the only reason why you can tell that the car is moving forward. It's because when it moves forward, the size of the car becomes bigger and bigger. So, that's the illusion of movement. Now, the screen car also uses depth cues, such again, size change. You can also use textual diffusion or speed change to create an illusion of 3-dimensional movement. Again, I would just want you to remember that those are just illusionary movement when you see it on screen. When you record it, it's a different thing. Of course, it's moving 3-dimensionally. But then when it's projected on screen, then comes the illusion. Now, movement in the screen world. In the screen world, there are only 3 things that can move. Okay? You're talking about the things that you can see on screen. Number 1, an object. Number 2, the camera. And number 3, the audience's point of attention as they watch the screen. Now, this is important. Okay? The audience's point of attention as they watch the screen. We're going to discuss that a bit further or a bit deeper later. Okay? Now, when you say object movement, anything that moves in relation to the frame line is a moving object. Every moving object generates a track. A track is a path of a moving object. There are 2 types of track, the actual and the virtual track. Now, these are discussed in detail in the lines and shape lecture that we discussed previously. They are discussed based on the track of the moving object, there are 4 ways to categorize movement of an object. So, we're talking about your subject or an object in the screen that is moving. Okay? So, we can categorize it in 4 ways. Number 1 is direction, quality, next is scale, and the last one is speed. Okay, when you talk about direction, an object can actually move in a limited number of direction on screen. Okay, because the screen is only 2-dimensional, now remember, object movement can be seen only when the object moves in relation to the frame line. That's what we talked about. Diba? Kailangan, okay, you have a frame line that is your reference to the moving object. An object can make a horizontal, vertical, diagonal, or circular move even when an object on screen appears to move in 3 dimensions. All the actual movement is only on the screen surface. Okay? It doesn't go... Kumbaga, again, it's a relative illusion of movement. Now, when you talk about quality, the movement of the object can be straight or curved. Since moving objects generate a track or a line, the same adjectives or emotional responses associated with straight lines and curved lines can be assigned to straight and curved movement. Okay? So generally, the track created by straight linear movement is associated with these characteristics. Well, when you say direct, aggressive, conservative, ordered, unnatural, and rigid. Now, when you say direct, when a person or a subject in your frame is moving on a straight line, okay, you can say that it is direct or aggressive. Okay, conservative or ordered, okay, or it is rigid. Now, the tracks created by curved movement can be associated with these characteristics naman. Diba? For if the straight line is direct, aggressive, or conservative, the curved lines are associated with indirect, passive, confused, pertaining to nature, so sometimes childlike, romantic, soft, safe, non-linear, and flexible. Okay? So again, it depends. Let's say, for example, you are shooting you are shooting a scene, and you are shooting a person, your character, okay, walking. Okay? Now, say for example that the character is in a confused state or in a confused manner. Okay? So ito yung sinasabi ko, that you use action to, di ba, when you write your script, I always tell my students to use actions to suggest the state of mind. Diba? Let's say the state of mind is confused. So of course, the actor will not, or you can say as a director, you can instruct the actors to, okay, for this particular scene, you are confused. So when you're walking, try to walk not on a straight line, but try to walk in a very curved pattern. Okay? So, in a way, pero hindi naman yung parang lasing. But what I'm talking about is you walk not just forward, but you walk somewhat going to the left and then going to the right. So, it can create, diba, a suggestion of movement that is, well, the state of mind of the actor or the state of mind of the character is a bit confused. So, let's say, for example naman, diba, you want, for example, you're going to shoot an action sequence. Diba? Or you're going to shoot, a very chaotic sequence, like a car chase sequence. Diba? When you remember, or please remember yung, let's say, Fast and the Furious, the Fast and the Furious franchise. Diba? When they chase their scenes, or when they do their chase scenes, it's not a race just on a straight line, diba? When they do that, they actually do that for fun. Diba? When they do a straight line, 60 seconds for 60, diba? A mile for 60 seconds, for example. So you see them in straight line. They are enjoying. They are doing something that they are comfortable doing. But then, when they do car chase scenes in an action sequence, it's filled with curves. It's filled with action. So, in a way, it becomes more dynamic. Okay? Now, these characteristics can create predictable stereotypes. So, ito yung sinasabi ko. As a director, you can actually use that. Okay? To create some sort of stereotypes. This is not a bad thing, because this is how you communicate the meaning of the scene to the audience. And are only a general guide. Your own feelings about straight and curved lines are created by tracks will affect how you use them. Okay, so it depends on, again, the approach of the director. Of course, you can say, okay, even if that person is confused, he can walk in a straight line, for example. Okay, you can use other elements, diba? That way you can use, diba? You can put them in a particular background. You can use lines that what work. That's the previous tools that we have talked about. Okay? So, but if you want to use movement, ayun yung gagamitin mo, or ayun yung gagawin mo. Now, next is scale. The scale refers to the distance of an object moves on screen. An object can travel for a short distance or an object can travel for a long distance. Now, guys, again, when I say an object, it doesn't necessarily mean just a car or let's say a ball or something. It can be a character in your film as well. Next is speed. Of course, a moving object will have a rate or speed. So how fast or slow the movement will be. The viewer will judge the object's speed relative, of course, to the frame. Okay, so next is camera movement. So although the audience sees the camera movement only by its effect on the objects in the frame, there are three basic ways to classify camera movement. Again, you have direction, you have scale, and speed. Direction, the camera can move into 2 or 3 dimensions. A 2-dimensional camera moves in plane or in pan or tilt or zoom. So, yun lang, di ba? When you talk about 2-dimensional movement of the camera, so you have pan, you have tilt, and you have zoom. Okay, that's the three. The 3-dimensional camera moves are a bit like dolly or track or crane, where the camera doesn't move in a straight line, okay, but it moves relatively curved on the implied illusion of depth in terms of the screen. Now, the audience perceives the camera movement because it is transferred to the object in the shot. The object will move in opposite direction of the camera move. When the camera pans right, objects, of course, in the picture will move left. A tilt up causes the objects in the frame to move down. Okay? The same thing happens with 3 dimensions or 3-dimensional camera moves. A track to the left will always make the objects in the frame move to the right, and the crane up will make the objects move down. Because of this transfer of movement, the camera movement itself is not as important as the effect of the movement has on the object in the frame. So, laging tatandaan, when you do your camera movements, there will always be a reference or a background. Next is scale. Scale refers to the camera's move length of travel. It can move again with a short or long distance. Speed. A camera movement can occur at slow, medium, or fast speeds. Okay? Generally speaking, a slower camera move creates affinity because changes in the visual component occur slowly. The faster a camera moves can generate visual intensity because the quick-moving camera view can produce rapid contrasting changes in the visual component. Okay? So, this is next, the point of attention. Okay? The third type of movement, point of attention, refers to the audience's eye movement. So, this time, it's you guiding the eyes or the attention of the audience. Okay? The audience's eye movement as they look at different areas of the screen. So, human vision can concentrate only on one small area of the visual field at a time. Although we have peripheral vision, which enables us to see a wide field of view, but we can only focus our attention on only one small area in the picture. Okay? When you look at a crowd of people, for example, you must shift your attention from face to face to recognize a specific person. Diba? So, let's say a crowd of people. So, basically, you're not going to see, of course, you're seeing the crowd of people, but when you're looking for someone in the crowd, of course, you're going to look for the faces of the people in the crowd. It is impossible to concentrate on 2 faces at once. So, you have to look at one face at a time. Now, the same thing happens when you look at a screen. although an audience is aware that the entire picture, they can focus their attention only on one small area of the screen at the same time. Now, this is very fortunate because it means that the picture makers or the directors can predict and control what part of the picture that you want to look the audience or you want to get the audience attention to. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. Okay, look at the three figures in front of you. Diba? The three figures in front of you, automatically when you see the three pictures, diba, your eye guides you to where to look at first. Diba? Where does the audience want to look in any of the picture? Okay? What attracts the audience's eye? So first is the movement, okay, and second is brightness. Okay, so first movement, next is brightness. In each picture, the viewer's eye is drawn to the object with a visual component contrast. Diba? In the first picture on your left, so you see the, diba, the frame always guides you to see the red circle rather than the three. Then, of course, you can allow yourself to see the three blue triangles. Now, on the middle frame, diba, your eye guides you to look at the white triangle first before looking at the two black triangles. Now, for the last frame or the frame on your right, diba, you see the green circle in front because, again, it suggests movement. Diba? So, again, brightness and movement. If you want, for example, to guide the attention of the audience in your screen, so first, movement, second is brightness. Now, if you really want to catch your audience's attention, you can combine both. Okay? So, brightness is second. If there is no movement, the viewer's point of attention will always be drawn to the brightest area of the frame. Okay? So, movement is the first. The viewer's attention will always be drawn to a moving object. Okay? So, first, the viewer's attention is drawn to a moving object. If there are no movement on frame, then the viewers will direct their attention to the brightest area of the frame. If a moving object also happens to be the brightest area of the frame, now the viewer will notice that object even quicker. When the audience is looking at the actor's face, diba, the point of attention always goes to the actor's or the subject's eyes. Okay? Any on-screen vanishing point will attract the viewer's attention. Okay? The audience's point of attention will always be drawn to contrast of differences in any visual component. May it be film, may it be just a photograph or a painting. So pag walang movement, brightness. Pagka may movement muna bago brightness. If you want to manipulate or if you want to catch the audience's attention quicker, so you make the moving object bright. So, point of attention, next is direction. As the audience move their point of attention around the frame, their eye movement creates a track. Remember, track is the path of a moving object, and here, the moving object is the audience's point of attention. Okay? So the audience will always go from side to side, or from up to down, or diagonally. Now, since the screen is flat, there is only three directions. Okay? Horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. So, yun lang yung, di ba, pag nanonood ka ng screen, you only move your eyes horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Next is quality. If the audience is watching a moving object that generates curved lines, their eye movement will curve as well. So if it's curved, Then of course, if a moving object is already caught the audience's attention, well, when it moves in a curved line, of course, that's the time that the eye follows the curved line. Their eye movement will curve. If the movement they're watching is linear, then the point of attention will generate straight lines. As the audience move their point of attention between stationary objects, they will take the shortest path. Okay? So their eye movement will usually create straight lines. Again, pag walang movement, usually straight lines yung nagiging scanning of the audience's attention. You can only create curved lines, or the audience's eyes can only be curved pagka may mag-guide na sa kanya, which is in our case, a moving subject. Now, next is scale. Now, scale refers to the distance the audience's point of attention travels in relation to the frame line. Now, the viewer's eye will travel the entire width of the screen as it watches two faces. Diba? When you see the figure or the illustration in front of you, you look at one face and then you look at another. In doing so, diba, your eyes travel diagonally in a straight line. Now, the travel distance is short. Later, in this chapter, we will discuss continuum of movement and their scale on the audience's eye movement. But basically, when you say scale, now it's the same thing. Your eyes travel from one face to another, but this time on a much shorter distance. Okay? Now, in terms of continuum of movement, so ito na. This is actually where every element or every component comes to mind. Okay? Now, the principle of contrast and affinity can be used with continuum of movement also, allowing control of the visual intensity generated by the audience's eye movement as they watch the screen. Like any visual component, affinity of continuum decreases and visual intensity and contrast of continuum increases visual intensity. So it depends on how you control. You can also control the visual or the continuum of movement using affinity or contrast. Later, I'm going to show you how. Okay, now continuum of movement occurs within a shot or from shot to shot. Okay, within a shot, just one shot, or one shot, edit from another shot. You can also connect the two shots together to form continuum. Now, using contrast of continuum of movement requires knowing the area of the screen the audience is watching. On their point of attention, okay, the visual components that will attract the audience's attention, again, just to reiterate, is, of course, again, movement, brightness of an object. Next, you can also put in the most saturated color, the actor's eye, or the object with the most visual contrast. Okay, now for our sake, for example, this is a screen in front of you. Okay, to indicate what the area or quadrant of the frame the audience is watching, we have 9 area grids, diba, that can be drawn on the screen or frame. This is called the continuum grid. Okay? Parang rule of thirds din. But this time kasi, we're going to track movements. Okay? Now, to indicate what area or quadrant of the frame the audience is watching, the 9 area grid can be drawn over the screen of the frame. Okay? So, nilagyan natin ng nilagyan natin ng numbers. Okay? So, for reference, the quadrants are marked or are numbered 1 to 9. Now, continuum of movement deals with two concepts. Of course, the viewer's point of attention moves within a shot, and the viewer's point of attention from shot to shot. Okay? It's within a shot or from shot to shot. Okay? So, dalawa yung point of attention natin, ha. Guys, I want you to keep track of what I'm saying. Okay? Okay. Affinity of continuum within a shot can be created without any camera or object movement. Here, there are two people engaged in a conversation. Now, as the dialogue alternates between them, the audience's point of attention will shift from one person to another. But in one shot, for example, in this particular frame shot, if the two characters are conversing, so essentially, the point of attention of the audience will go to the person who is talking. Let's say the guy is talking, then you shift your attention to the guy. And when the girl is talking, you shift the attention to the girl. Okay? Now, the continuum grid superimposed over the frame shows that both people are in the same quadrant. Diba? They are in the quadrant number 2, 4, 6. 2, 4, 7. Sorry. 1, 2, 5, 6. 2, 4, and 8. Quadrants. Okay? This creates affinity of continuum of movement. Okay? The contrast of continuum of movement can also exist within a shot. I'm going to show you how. Okay? The same two people are now further apart and the contrast of continuum of movement is now created. Diba? Kanina, affinity because they are closer together. Now, when you put them apart, then comes contrast. Okay? The movement is created because the viewer's point of attention must shift between the quadrants 3 to 6 as the two people talk. Kanina kasi, they are in the same quadrant. Diba? They are closer together. But this time, because they are on a different quadrant, diba? Then you create contrast already. So, diba? You create more distance to it because, again, the two people are now on a more farther quadrant. Then, you create contrast. Okay? Affinity, if it's called, ito within the shot, this is within the shot. Okay? Okay, affinity if the two subject is closer together, contrast if they're farther apart. Okay? The audience's point of attention is not visually guided by a moving object from person to person. Okay? So that the audience must abruptly move their point of attention each time the conversation changes the speaker. So it's still the same. The point of attention will happen as the person is talking. Kung sino yung nagsasalita, doon ka mag-focus ng attention. Okay? Now, in this particular case, you create a contrast lang because you placed it in two farther, farther quadrants. Now, if you put it even on the left screen, for example, you put it on the right screen or the left screen, but they are closer together in that specific quadrant, then again, it's still a fit. As the distance between the two increases, the contrast of continuum increases as well. Again, this is from within a shot lang. Okay. Now, in this widescreen frame, the audiences must shift their attention or their point of attention at a greater distance. As the size of the screen shrinks, the range of contrast of continuum decreases. So, as the size of the screen becomes wider, so nag-increase yung contrast as the size of the screen comes closer. Okay, the contrast decreases and comes the affinity. Okay, contrast and affinity of continuum of movement within a shot can also occur using movement objects. Or objects movement, sorry. Affinity of continuum occurs when moving objects hold and lead the viewer's attention. A man enters a frame and walks to a waiting woman, for example. The man stops next to the woman, and after the moment, the woman walks away. So, again, diba? It provides affinity as well and contrast and affinity as well. Pag towards, diba, you are if the subjects move towards each other, or one subject moves towards another subject, you create affinity. If it moves, diba, far away from one another, you create contrast. Okay? Continuing within the shot, the audience's point of attention is smoothly transferred from the first to the second object because the second object begins moving in the same quadrant. So, where the first object stops. This affinity of continuum moves the audience's point of attention across the screen in a choreographed pattern following the first, then the second object. So, when the two subjects are moving, diba, you can create continuum within the shot. Okay, next. In this example, there are two moving objects. The man in the background enters and stops. Then after, the moment the woman in the foreground enters the frame, the audience's attention will shift. Okay? From then moving diagonally from the man to the woman. So, diba? Let's say, dito papasok yung lalaki, of course, it will catch your attention. Diba? Kung dito siya papasok. And then after that, biglang may pumasok na babae dito. Of course, your focus will change from one to another point. There is no on-screen movement to guide the viewer's point of attention from the first object to the next. Okay? This change of quadrant is contrast of continuum of movement. Kasi nga, okay, you guide the audience from one side of the screen to another. Now, let's do from shot to shot. Okay? Continuum of movement becomes even more important when the shots are edited together. Now, here are the two shots that I want you to imagine. Okay? One shot is a wide shot of an actor standing in a doorway. And the second shot, diba? Then cut to, okay, a close-up of the same actor. Okay? Now, in the wide shot, the point of attention is the actor on the doorway, diba? On the right quadrant of the screen. And in the close-up, the point of attention is the actor's eyes. So this time on the left quadrant of the screen. Okay? Now, diba, if the two shots are superimposed, the different attention points are visible na. Okay? So again, first shot, left quadrant. First shot, right quadrant. And then cut to the next shot, which is the left quadrant. So, diba? Nagkaroon ng separation. Again, when you say separation, okay, editing these shots together will create continuum of movement because on the cut, the audiences pay attention and jumps from the first quadrant to the second quadrant, or in this case from quadrant 3, the screen right, to quadrant 4, okay, the screen left. This generates contrast of continuum. Okay, so again, two shots when edited together creates contrast of continuum. Now, let's do affinity. Okay? Continuum from shot to shot. One shot can be recomposed to create affinity of continuum. So, the same two shots, but this time, you put the second shot, diba, on the right side of the screen then. Now, when you superimpose them together, diba, superimposing the shot shows that the point of continuum, or the point of attention of the audience is in the same quadrant. So this creates affinity of continuum. A movement because the audience's point of attention will not move even if you cut from one shot to another. The point of attention remains at the same quadrant for both shots. So, hindi na mag-move yung point of attention ng character, ng audience when you cut from one shot to another. Okay, so that's affinity of movement. Now, for example, you magmo-move yung point of attention from the left side to the right screen. Now you create contrast. Okay? The continuum of movement within a shot or in a series of shots can be planned in the storyboard. Diba? This is where directing, the art of directing comes in. Okay, you work with your DOPs or your cinematographers for these kinds of techniques. Again, a continuum from shot to shot. Let's have another example. Now, shot 1 indicates the object's movement. Let's say this is a moving car and the other is a running actor. So, shot 1, for example, is the moving car and shot 2 is the running actor. So, beginning in quadrant 7 or the lower left of your screen and then moving straight to quadrant 9 from the lower right of your screen. Now, the curved movement in shot 2 begins in the same spot where the movement ended in the shot. Ended in shot 1. So, this time for shot 2, diba? It's in quadrant 9 or your lower right, tapos magka-curve siya towards quadrant 7 or lower left. So, that's shot 2. So, dalawa na yung shots natin, ha. Again, when you superimpose them together, the continuum of movement is revealed. Now, the audience's point of attention, okay, will move with shot 1 and smoothly transition to shot 2. The two movements, when edited together, will merge into one continuous track or line. This is an example of the affinity of continuum of movements from shot to shot. Kasi, although dalawa yung shot mo, pero yung movement mo, diba, yung ginaid mo yung point of attention ng audience from one movement to another, and then when you when you edit it into another shot with another movement, you create basically a flowing a flowing movement. So, isa yung point of reference. So, kumbaga, you just follow the moving objects. Then, edit it, another moving object, but you have, di ba, sinambot noong second moving object yung first. So, you create then, kumbaga, you create a flowing movement pa din. So, again, that's affinity. Now, say, for example, for contrast, shot 3 and 4 illustrates contrast of continuum of objects from shot to shot. From shot 3, the object moves from quadrant 7, lower left, the same movement that we did earlier, to lower right. But cut to shot 4, okay, the audience point of attention must quickly move up to quadrant 3, diba, dun sa upper right, to find the next moving object. And the audience is an aided shift of attention on the cut creates contrast of continuum. So, disrupted yung audience. Yung una kasi, di ba, for affinity, after nitong shot na to, you go to the next shot, so kita mo pa rin, parang sinambot pa rin ng moving object yung attention ng audience. Now, in this particular shot, for contrast naman, nag-move kang gano'n, biglang susunod, iba naman yung movement ng ano. So, it creates contrast. Okay? Now, when shots 3 and 4 are superimposed, again, the contrast of continuum of movement is apparent. Now, there are two complete separate lines on the track that generates movement. Okay, so yun yung contrast. Now, okay, but the combination of shots, let's say for example, shot 3 and 4 actually has 3 lines. Okay? Then the two are created by moving objects in the frame. The third line is actually generated. Diba? Etong eye movement nito, okay, is generated, the audiences pay attention moving up first the object in quadrant 9 to the second object in quadrant 3 in the upper right. Tapos saka movement. So, for imagine, so for affinity, you only have one movement. But when you do contrast of movement, di ba, even with the two movements lang, you create three movements in the audience's eyes. Left, up, and then you go, and then you follow the curve. The importance of continuum of movement in a shot or series of shots can be planned in a storyboard. Again, the arrows in each storyboard picture indicate the movement of an object in the frame. Okay, for example, in this storyboard, storyboard number 1, notice that the curvilinear tracks and the affinity of the continuum of movement. So, ito affinity to. Okay, the attention will be on the left off of your screen in one shot and then pick up from the next shot into the same quadrant. So, kumbaga, even if it's moved in several different directions, but you follow it smoothly. Okay, so nagsasambutan yung mga shots mo. Okay, so again, it is affinity pa rin. Combining all the pictures into a single frame reveals that the linear motif created by the track of an object movement from shot to shot, the eye's path of movement is choreographed around the frame in a circular manner. Smooth. Diba? From 1, and then 2, and then 3. So even though there are a lot of curves, so nagsasambutan sila sa isa't isa. Now, the affinity of continuum of movement reduces visual intensity and the smoothness of transitions from one shot to another. So, it creates a more relaxed feel if you just follow the tracks. Okay, even if it's done in cuts, diba? Even if it's done from shot to shot, if you follow the movement, then you create a smoother effect. Now, storyboard number 2 uses straight lines, okay, on tracks instead of curves, but there is still affinity of continuum. Even though you did straight lines, but the audiences follow, again, sinambot pa rin noong moving object yung point of attention ng audience. Okay? There's still affinity of continuum of the movement. The incoming movement starts at the same quadrant, then the outgoing movement stops. Okay? When all the pictures are superimposed on your right, okay, into a single frame, the linear motif is still revealed. The straight line, angular lines on track create still a smooth continuity. So, it doesn't have to be curved. It can do straight lines. Again, kailangan lang magsambutan yung mga frames mo in terms of movement. Now, storyboard number 3 is different altogether, diba? Storyboard number 3 is full of contrasts. There's contrast on the straight and curved lines, diagonal, horizontal, and vertical tracks. And the contrast of continuum of movement, the point of attention quadrant is never really the same from shot to shot. So, 1, biglang bababa, 2, biglang curve, 3, biglang down. So, it creates sort of a chaotic feel. So, wala kang sinusundan na dot or wala kang sinusundan na movement. But from cut to cut, the point of attention shifts. Okay? Now, the point of attention quadrant is never the same from shot to shot. On each editorial cut, the audiences must shift their point of attention to another quadrant. Okay? To find the next moving object. Now, this linear motif in storyboard number 3, which is the most intense, because it uses much visual contrast and the total number of lines has actually doubled. Not only are there linear lines generated by the tracks on the moving object, but there are also lines produced by the tracks of the audience's moving point of attention. So, kumbaga, again, how can you use it? How can you use this? How can you apply this in filmmaking, di ba? Again, if you want to create a contrast, a very chaotic scene, di ba? Even in a sequence, so you use contrasting movement, di ba? You basically what do you call this? Guide the audience's attention, di ba? In a very chaotic manner. If you want to if you want to shoot a scene that is, again, a bit more relaxed or a bit more smooth, then you create affinity. of movement. Okay. Now, storyboards 1, 2, and 3 create a visual progression. Okay. Now, based purely on the amount of contrast and affinity, storyboard 1 is the least intense because it uses visual affinity. Storyboard 2 still uses visual affinity. It's more intense because it uses straight line, but it still has affinity to it. Now, storyboard number 3 is different altogether. It is the most intense because of the visual contrast of the line quality, direction, and even the continuum of movement of the audience. Okay? Now, continuum of movement is planned and created by the director and the cinematographer, but ultimately comes under control by the editor, obviously. The editor's continuum control will be limited to the shots produced during the production, but the editor who understands continuum of movement has an additional tool to manipulate the intensity of scenes and sequences. Once in the editing room, it is easy to determine where the audience is or where the audience is looking in any shot. Okay? View the shot and be aware of your own point of attention. Stop the footage and mark the viewing screen with a grease pencil, for example, so that you can know. So dito ko na i-connect yung for my second cut or for my second clip. Okay? Now you've probably found the correct point of attention based on your own natural instincts. So as a filmmaker, when you produce your film, of course, you have already used this. Okay? If you're still not sure, watch the footage without sound in a darkened room, and your visual intuition will usually take over and direct your eye to the same point on the screen that will attract the audience. Okay? Because when you watch it, of course, you become an audience yourself. So this creates control, diba? For the director to basically control the attention of the audience. Now, continuum of movement is nearly invisible. Okay? Visual component that has enormous impact to the audience, but it is invisible. Diba? As the screen size increases, so does the chance for greater contrast of continuum of movement. As the screen shrinks in size, the chances for contrast and continuum diminishes. Now, the contrast and affinity of continuum of movement affect the intensity or dynamics of the edited sequences. Visual intensity will increase as more contrast of continuum is used, and visual intensity will decrease if there is affinity of continuum of movement. Affinity of continuum guides the audience's point of attention as they look around the frame. The picture maker can manipulate the audience and control the area of the screen they watch. Okay, this is a critical factor in television commercials because you only have a very short amount of time. But in complete films, the audience should be unaware of the editing. Dapat, diba, as an audience, you don't really mind the editing. Okay? Affinity of continuum of movement improves visual continuity and is such a powerful visual tool that it can disguise visual errors, including continuity mistakes and the screen's direction problems. Affinity makes visual events and transitions appear continuous and smooth. Any contrast creates intensity naman. Contrast of continuum of movement can be visually disjointed, jarring, and abrupt. So if you have to use this judiciously also. So again, you can create this, but if you use this too much, it can create a very uncomfortable experience to the audience. Now, the audience can become agitated or excited when forced to quickly move from their attention to a different quadrant of the screen without apparent motivation. So, if you use it judiciously, it can create excitement. But if you use it all the time, or if you use it without actually thinking, then it can create agitation to the audience. Okay? Contrast of continuum of movement separates actions and removes transitions. As the contrast of continuum increases, so will the visual intensity of the sequence. Okay? So action filled can create more visual. If you want to create more visual intensity, you use contrast, okay, of continuum of movement. If you want to generate, or if you want to project a smooth appeal or a relaxed appeal, a pleasant appeal to the audience, then you use affinity of continuum of movement. Okay? So that wraps up my lecture on movement. So if you have any questions can be sent via course message or via private message or during our live session. Okay? Now, again, this is the end of my lecture. Thank you very much for watching. Please keep safe and think about the films or imagine the films that you want to do in the future. Thank you very much again, and I'll see you in my next video.